The mood after the announcement was mixed to say the least. Of course, there was some mood for celebrations, or at least relief, now that their goal had technically been reached. However, the method left everyone with a bitter taste in their mouth. Nobody quite trusted the piece. Even James, who stayed on the sum as a relatively free man, had now been extended for quite a bit by the aftermath of the election, couldn't quite get into any mood to be happy about it. After all, this is exactly what I was worried about, and now we have to face the freaking music. And who knows what they're going to do next now that we have no access to them anymore, he rambled, while agitatedly walking in circles around the field of crops in the middle of the large room, trying to burn off some of the excess energy that threatened to build up within him.
Please, James, thinking yourself into a frenzy will not make the situation any better,
Maud gently commented, as one of her large eyes followed him through the room, which involved her entire massive head turning, so one side of her face could always face him directly.
Why not try talking it through with me again? It might help you order your thoughts.
Within James, conflicting forces were at work. His first instinct was to deflect and ponder for himself. On the other hand, she was right in that frantic energy wasn't exactly the best thing for him and his nerves right now. As they spoke, a much more important conversation was taking place not far from them. After the results of the election had been announced, and the decision to disband the current council had been finalized, a general strategy meeting for the future action of the UHSDF, and by extension James himself, had been called. From the sovereign leadership of Mars to the triad Kakumenia of the Central European Consolidation, anyone who had any official control over armed forces within the territories of humanity was currently connected over a single line and discussed what would happen next. Of course, despite James being directly involved, his measly rank of First Lieutenant still meant that the entire conversation was leagues above his pay grade, and so they would rely on the numerous written reports of everything he could possibly tell them in their assessment, and he would have to wait what they decided. Of course, he knew these people weren't dumb. Many of them had years and decades worth of tactical and political experience that he lacked, and obviously anything he could come up with, they could as well. But to convince the human mind that it did not see things no one else could see could be a challenge sometimes, and he couldn't help but worry that they would overlook something.
I think I understand the basics of it,
the old woman reiterated, trying to get James back to talking after he seemingly got stuck in his own mind.
But tell me what exactly has you so worried about the council disbanding?
James took a deep breath, which he then let out with a slow sigh. Sadly, I can hardly think of a better move the council could have made than what they did. They are not dumb, I have to give them that, he explained, folding his hands to stop himself from fidgeting with them. Still, he couldn't quite keep from at least rubbing his thumbs together restlessly as he continued. It basically covers all their bases. Nobody knows how long an election will take, and since they have to organize it, they can basically stay in power as long as they wish, since the galaxy still needs to be governed in the meantime, with the added benefit of now being basically immune to any legal consequences for the time being, as long as they still candidate in the next election, which they automatically will unless they willingly step down. And that's just the start of it. In the meantime, they still have the assurance that they still hold the majority in votes, so most of them don't really have to worry about being re-elected. In fact, the only reason the election turned out to be so close was likely the handful of now-known bad actors among the council, meaning during the re-election most individual council members not yet accused of anything will probably get even more support of the people. And they now have incredibly valuable data, telling them exactly which groups already support them, and which they have to win over for themselves. So the only one really giving away their influence are those that have already been exposed for now, while all yet unknown actors lose basically nothing. In short, they managed to take every advantage they could for themselves, in my humble opinion, and we're now fighting an uphill battle. Just as Moore had said, speaking it all out loud really did help him bring all the chaotic thoughts and worries in his mind into a certain order. It also helped deflate some of the upbuilding erratic energy within him again, allowing him to stop his pacing and most of his fidgeting, although the rubbing of his thumbs against each other remained still, as he allowed himself to sink into a leaning against the room's wall.
Sufficiently summarized indeed, Dancer.
Conglorch, who was taking up most of the wall on the opposite side of the room to Moore, commented, managing in his low rumble to make it sound like both mockery and an honest compliment at the same time in an expressive feat of verbalism. James didn't know if the governments of the Tamastrasites were also included in the current strategy meeting. It was a possibility, given their close relations to humanity. On the other hand, he didn't even know their exact stance on the current occurrences. Do you know what your people's thoughts on this entire ordeal are, by the way? He asked, deciding that it was probably the easiest method to get that cleared up right away. Conglorch bellowed deeply, and two of his constantly searching eyes snapped around to look at James. They were a surprisingly handy indicator of how interested he was in the conversation at any given time.
The news is still too young to say anything for certain. However, despite only appearing recently on the galactic stage, humanity is already one of our closest allies, and it has been a long time since the Council has made a decision that found unanimous agreement with our people, the plated Titan said, crossing its arms while its long tail made a slow, sweeping motion across the floor. Therefore, I personally find it hard to think that anyone would believe that what humanity is trying to achieve would not also be best for us. Although opinions can differ, of course, and maybe some of us have let themselves be fooled by the Council's public display.
That sounded like they weren't going to lose their closest ally just yet, at least. James really hoped that those letting themselves be fooled that easily would remain at a minimum, and he didn't just mean the tenaciousness with that. He thought about the current conference, full of humanity's leadership once again, and although he still knew many of them were a lot more qualified than he was, he also couldn't confidently say he had utmost faith in each and every one of them. He could only hope that they would be reeled in by the rest. Admittedly, his trust in politicians and leaders, that had never been that great to begin with, had plummeted somewhat ever since his more recent experiences. However, he had little choice but to leave it to the people in power. After all, what else was he supposed to do?
I just hope that those who have been treated well by the community will also be able to have their mind changed, Moore said,
reaching up to thoughtfully run her claws along her notched horns, causing a rhythmic clacking sound. Clearly, she was thinking about her own people, and likely about the message she had sent to them back on the GCS before shit had absolutely hit the fan. Despite all the time that had passed, they were still yet to hear anything official from the Raphaelite government on the matter, and clearly the old woman began to worry about that. And in a way, they were sort of representative for all those species who had taken well to the community's norms and customs, but didn't enjoy any particular privileges within it. They are all rational beings, James finally said convincingly, putting his foot down on any doubts he might have had by sinking his right canine into his lip harshly. If we manage to show them what lies beneath the surface, they will surely see that things can't go on like this. He nodded to himself as if to even further confirm the stance. If he didn't believe at least that, he might as well give up right there and then. The bright artificial sunlight of the greenhouse-like room reflected softly on Moore's glistening fur, and her dark eyes as she looked over at him, a pleasant and gentle expression forming on her face, that screamed of a smile without her actually smiling.
And I could not be more glad that you still feel that way, even after everything, she said softly, with something akin to a relieved chuckle in her voice.
James laughed breathlessly, and threw his head up, closing his eyes so he wouldn't look directly into the half-full race from above. How could I not? He asked, giving his voice a slightly joking tone. I made about as many friends in my time in space as I did enemies. Moore nodded her large head and immediately let out some breath through her nose. Then, her expression suddenly changed, as she turned her head further to look at him, even more directly, her gaze turning inquisitive all of a sudden.
Speaking of friends,
she said, and looked around the room as if she needed to reconfirm something, although it was likely just for show.
While I certainly appreciate you checking up on an old woman every now and then, why is it that you have shown up all alone today? Usually, even if you come to visit me, you have some form of company with you.
James scoffed and now also demonstratively looked to the door leading to the hallway outside of the room. Well, now that Mars is forced to contact us here, Shada has her interview with the officials there. You two should probably expect yours to come soon as well, James said, internally hoping that everything was going well with that. No idea what's going on with everyone else, though. It's almost like I missed a memo or something. Everyone was already up when I looked for them, and honestly, I don't want to disturb them in case there's something important. After all, there's a lot going on today. All of them were still soldiers, after all. Having duties that kept them busy every now and then was the most expected of all things. Well, except for Nia, that was. He really had no idea what was going on with her. Not like she was overburdened with work during her time here. Yet it seemed his sister had been swallowed whole by the earth that wasn't underneath them all the same. She also didn't react to his texts, which sounded a lot more typical for him than it was for her, although it wasn't entirely unheard of. Still, that it happened on the same day that everyone else was suddenly busy did give him some food for thought. Although worrying about even more things would surely be unhealthy. It wasn't like anything could have happened to them. They were on board of a damn warship after all. Not much that could happen here without causing a fuss.
Who knows? Maybe they are busy with the festivities,
Conglor suddenly suggested, the claws of his large maulers rhythmically clanking on the floor while only a single one of his eyes curiously studied James.
While the situation may not be ideal, some of your people still seem to be content with celebrating a supposedly favourable outcome of the vote.
What is that saying again? Small victories?
James looked at the Lizardor incredulously, studying his demeanour for any sort of joke or humour, but he didn't find anything. Where'd you get that idea? He asked, finding it hard to imagine that soldiers of all people would want to celebrate something like that, especially when the higher-ups were currently discussing the best way to deal with this supposed victory. Konglog shook both his head and his long neck while humming a low rumble.
You need to look around more, Dancer, the Tonashasai commented challengingly, and exposed some of his long, sharp teeth. For the entire day, your people have been carrying decorations around. Don't tell me you have not noticed that.
Decorations? James hadn't seen any decorations. And why were people carrying them around instead of hanging them up? Moore seemed to be just as confused as he was, so she clearly hadn't noticed anything either. Then again, Tonashasai did have a very well-trained eye for details, so could he possibly have seen something that James had missed? And what kind of decorations? James inquired further, ignoring his first impulse to deny the existence of any decorations in the first place. A deep bellow sounded from Konglor's chest, as the Titan apparently began to enjoy the conversation somewhat. It seemed that, no matter how minor, the feeling of being superior to something pleased him, and James didn't quite know how to feel about that.
If I had to put a name to them, I'd say they were likely flags. Konglor ventured a guess as to what exactly he had seen, although it seemed that he wasn't 100% confident in that assessment. I recognized none of them as nations of humanity, but they were quite colourful. Therefore I assumed they might be used for decorative purposes.
Flags as decorations? Not entirely unheard of, but usually they were only used in combination with other things, not alone. And that still left the question why people were just carrying them around. Had he really not gotten a memo somehow? Based on a sudden hunch, he quickly pulled out his phone to check something he hadn't looked at in a long time. What day was it on Earth? His heart bumping in slight anticipation, he looked over the white letters on his screen. The 8th of October. Well, that would explain things. Immediately, James's hand shot up to heavily slap himself in the face, in one of the most genuine face palms he had ever given himself. It's the day for respect, he exasperatedly mumbled through his hand, disbelieving that something like that could have gotten past him. While Moore and Konglor looked at him confusedly, his hand slid down from his face and, in the same motion, called up a number on his phone, pulling it up to his ear. It didn't take long until someone picked up. "Hey, Sam?" James said, completely forgetting to use Athena's usual nickname in his embarrassment as soon as the captain had answered her phone. "So, I just looked at the calendar." The first thing that James did when he arrived in one of the large common areas, where everyone else had gathered, was to walk up right to his sister and look her directly in the face. "I'll get you back for this, Missy, just you wait," he said in a mixture of jest and betrayal, and pointed his finger right at her nose while glaring at her intensely. Instead of reminding him of the holiday once she had noticed that he had forgotten, she had instead elected to ignore his calls and messages for today, leaving him out to dry. Of all days, she had chosen today to be a fucking sibling. And she wasn't at all impressed by his display, laughing as she swiped his finger away from her face. "I was wondering how long it would take you to realize," she said with an amused snigger. "And careful where you point that." James scowled at her, lowly mumbling, "Well, I have other things on my mind at the moment." Nia's smile turned from mocking to gentle, as she picked something thin and silky from her lap and gently put it around his neck like a scarf, holding on to both sides so she could pull him in slightly closer. "Well, you're here now. That's all that counts, isn't it?" she asked, and gently blew him a kiss before letting go of the fabric, and allowing James to stand up straight again. James looked down to his shoulders and reached up to inspect what she had just given to him there. The fabric was thin and gritted against itself, as he rubbed it between two fingers. The blue background, with mostly left-oriented stars, was instantly recognizable. Around his neck hung the flag of the former West European Federation. "I figured you'd like that one more than this," Nia said, after she saw him study the flag and demonstratively lifted the black, red and golden flag of the former Federal Republic of Germany that she was still holding. Well, it wasn't that James actually cared that much. Both nations were long gone, and they had been a while before any of them had been born. However, if he had to choose, he indeed preferred the West European flag over the just German one. Looking around, those of course weren't the only flags that were present, now that he had paid attention to it. Maple leaves, red dots, white crosses, crescent moons, and so much more had all been carried around throughout the ship.
possibly hundreds of flags overall, each representing a nation that was no more. Bad times or not, everyone seemed excited for the Day of Respect.
I take it these are not used for festivities, then?
Conglorch asked, having caught up to James and now looking down at the fabric loosely hung around the primate's neck.
Oh, yes they are,
Admir exclaimed, excitedly answering the question before James even could, while proudly carrying the double-headed black eagle in front of his chest.
You can bet on that.
James chuckled, as the giant's head warily snapped around to the enthusiastic man, 2 fiery eyes directed at him.
Well, but they're not used for decoration at least, James chimed in, getting him the attention of one of Conglorch's other eyes. They're the main event.
Did you come to enjoy the festivities with us? Admir then asked, looking up at the 2 giants that James had brought with him with a big smile on his face, because even if you didn't, I hereby officially invite you to join us in our Day for Respect. Conglorch still seemed to be slightly wary of the sheer amount of enthusiasm that Admir brought to the table. However, Moore appeared instantly fascinated by the prospect.
A day for respect?
She politely inquired, clearly insinuating the need for an explanation while stepping a bit closer to Admir. Admir, on the other hand, was quick to twirl around in place as he loudly announced, "And what a fine day for respect it is! Wouldn't you say so, Sam? In fact, I would say we really lucked out this year. I can hardly imagine a better day for it." And with that, he had effectively handed off the burden of explanation to his teammate while he just laughed it off. It was clear on Athena's face that she was in a discussion with herself on whether she should lose her nose on him or not. However, in the end, she decided with a sigh that it just wasn't worth it. "Well, it is certainly fitting," she said, getting up from her crouching position near the group, where she had seemingly inspected a large, round contraption that was placed in the middle of the room, to talk to them more easily. All the while, she was a lot more careful with the stars and stripes she had pressed to her chest than anyone else seemed to be with their respective flags. The blonde Amazon looked up at Moore and Conglorch with a polite yet professional smile, and shook her long hair out of her face in a practice motion. "The 8th of October, also known as the Day for Respect, is a special day for us. Well, actually, it used to be a special day for my people specifically, but, well, things happen." She began her explanation. "Originally, it is remembered as the day the United States, stopped being the United States, I guess. The United States of America used to be a very important nation on Earth back in the day," James quickly clarified for the Offworlders, who seemed to be rather confused by the simple use of the United States, but after the explanation they quickly understood. Athena nodded at James appreciatively. "Anyway, the people who used to live there, my ancestors basically, were extremely proud of their nation, and even when it was combined with other nations to form the unification of North America, they really weren't quite willing to give that up. And so, to honour the past and also give a proper send-off to the nation they loved, they created the Day for Respect," she went on. Moore seemed quite fascinated by the idea of the day, and carefully listened to what Athena had to say. Conglorch, on the other hand, while remaining respectful and certainly intrigued by the holiday, was a bit more impatient about it.
"And what does that have to do with the flags, if I may ask?"
he pried, three of his eyes looking around to multiple of the flags around him, while one remained focused on Athena herself. By now, the conversation was starting to attract some attention, and more people closed in on the explanation given to the Offworlders. "You see, when a flag is deemed no longer fit for its use as a symbol, we believe in giving it a proper relief from its duty," Athena continued with her explanation, and briefly unfolded the flag she was carrying with her to present it openly. "In the States, that was usually done via a ceremonial burning. Granted, there were other ways as well, but burning was the most popular one. And since the stars and stripes were no longer used to represent the nation, after it had merged into the UNA, they deemed it appropriate to give it one final relief from its duties. So, once a year, on the day of the end of set duty, we thank it for its service and bid it goodbye."
"Yep, we used to give them a lot of shit for it in the past,"
Admir jokingly chimed in, entirely changing the mood of the conversation. Athena glanced at him annoyed for a second, and then just rolled her eyes.
"I am not sure I understand,"
Moore carefully stated, either unfamiliar with the matter of speech, or unsure why someone would give them shit for such an act. To her, the ritual seemingly appeared quite understandable.
"It's true."
Andras then joined the conversation, closing his eyes and shaking his head while his voice told of regretful reminiscence.
"The practice of greeting for a former nation, and even more specifically its flag, appeared quite odd to the people of many other nations, and so it was the source of some mockery for some time."
With a seemingly honestly saddened expression, The Major's crimson eyes looked down to the flag he carried, hung over his arm himself, showing vertical stripes of blue, yellow, and red. However, his mood seemed to dramatically clear up when he spoke up again, saying, "But in the end, it wasn't all bad. Some people began to join in the festivities with their own flags. Admittedly, at first this was out of mockery as well, but over time, it gradually became more genuine. People began to realize that having a day to officially leave a part of your past behind you, be it symbolic or not, could be quite cathartic. And soon, the Day for Respect was celebrated in way more parts of the human territories than just the former United States, even if the date itself doesn't really have the same meaning to most of them. And now we can all enjoy the festivities together." Moore nodded slowly. "That sounds rather nice," she said, briefly combing through some of her fur with her claws while obviously reminiscing about something. "Well, I for one would love to join you in your Day of Respect, although I am afraid I have no flag with me." Athena snorted. "That's fine," she said, waving Moore's concerns off with a flat hand. "It's more about the thought anyways."
"Well, I can certainly see why you would think it is appropriate," Conglosh then commented, his Moloch tapping the floor and his eyes zeroing in on Admir.
"Right?" Admir replied excitedly, and loudly chuckled. Now that James was here, he was quickly roped into helping out with the preparations for the ceremony itself, while Conglosh and Moore were further informed about all kinds of intricacies and stories connected to the holiday. The ceremonial burning of the flag demanded for a large, impressive fire, something that wasn't easily safely achievable on board of a spaceship. The clean-burning cauldron, a large apparatus consisting of a huge metal pan on a steel framework, still had to be connected to the large gas bottles it used as a fuel source. Meanwhile, the fire safety procedures of the room had to be briefly made more tolerant to allow for the fire to burn without the room going into emergency mode. To compensate for that, fire extinguishers out the wazoo had to be placed absolutely everywhere, to leave no spark so much as a chance of kindling. Not that there was a lot of flammable things around anyway, given the metal nature of their surroundings, but regulations were regulations. Given that it was a known holiday, the entire procedure was fairly standard, and went off without a hitch. And during the preparations, slowly more and more people occupying this part of the ship started to come around. You could quickly make out those who rarely visited the lower gravity decks of the ship, as they jumped and bounced around with each careless step, and clearly delighted in their perceived lightness after their weight had been cut down by 2/3. Familiar faces arrived as well. Dr. Tracy gave James a polite courtesy nod as she arrived, before professionally pretending like she didn't know him and moving to the other side of the room, while Dr. Schramm, who had even managed to bring along Curie, arrived with an enthusiastic greeting and wide-open arms for his patient. Tuya, who seemingly had once again lent a hand in medical engineering, followed shortly after, reuniting with her team under the typical scrutiny that being the last to arrive usually brought with it. And finally, likely through some form of help or tip extended by any of the present people who had her phone number, Shida also found her way into the large open room. "Did everything go well with the meeting?" James asked immediately, after he had given her a short briefing on what it was that had brought all of them together here. "I think so," Shida answered, her eyes on James while her ears excitedly twitched around to pick up on all sorts of noises that were made by the congregating humans around them. "I mean, they didn't immediately revoke my sanctuary, so that has to count for something, I guess. But they said they'll still need time to fully process my applications." "Well, obviously. Stuff like that would take ages to go through bureaucracy hell." "Good," James replied anyway, and pulled her in for a quick hug. "That's good." Although the preparations still went on smoothly, time flew like an arrow, and once everything was settled and ready, hours had passed. Finally, a man who James didn't recognize, but who was identified as a commander by the markers on his uniform, stepped up to the cauldron. "Attention!" he loudly announced, putting his feet together and bringing his chest out. The soldiers of the room took up posture, while the civilians turned quiet and looked on. "Everyone carrying the stars and stripes, step forward now." As the originators of the holiday, the North Americans still enjoyed the privilege of being the ones to initiate the ceremony. In a strong march, all those who carried the red, white and blue flags of the former United States stepped forth towards the cauldron, holding them respectfully upright as they did so, and ordered themselves in a line based on their ranks. The commander himself then turned to do the same, taking up position in front of the cauldron. The lights in the room were slightly dimmed at this point, and with the click of a button, the cauldron was ignited. Bright orange flames eagerly burst out of the metal pan, licking the air in many tendrils while searching for anything flammable they could reach. Their movement sent long, dark shadows dancing throughout the room and across the walls, and their heat could be sensed even from far away. The fire was ready. "Present the flag," the commander then loudly ordered, and the first highest-ranking soldier in the line stepped forward and held out the flag with their head held up high. The commander looked the flag up and down before respectfully raising his hand to a salute. "These flags have served their nation well and long. Now the nation they have served has moved on, and their duty to represent it is done. These flags represent all the flags that were retired on this day, many years in the past. This honor we show here this evening for these flags. We show for all the flags, even those not physically here," he loudly proclaimed, to which every soldier in the room stood at attention and posed in a salute. With that, the commander respectfully nodded at the line of soldiers before him, and then stepped aside, allowing them to, one after the other and with respectful distance and weight between each of them, offer the flags up to the fire, where they were consumed and turned to nothing, up dancing ashes within mere seconds. The ceremony to retire our flags to in-service was of course even more complex, and involved even more ceremonial conduct. However, that honour was reserved only for the flags still in service, and therefore the ceremony had been slightly shortened for the holiday. After all the stars and stripes had been consumed by the flames, the commander and the other soldiers stepped aside, allowing everyone else to approach the fire in a much less orderly fashion, to offer up their own respective flags to their respectful end. James could feel the blistering heat of the fire press against the synthetic skin of his robotic arm, as he slowly spun the West European flag into the fire, watching the blue colour and stars disappear in an eruption of black and grey, at almost an instant once it had been fully engulfed by the flames. James stared into the bright orange inferno that left no trace of anything offered to it. When he looked down at his hand, he saw that the heat had even left some dark marks on him. A burst of heat then suddenly swept past his entire body, giving his skin a tight feeling for a second before he finally stepped away. With a bit of sweat on his brow, he quickly returned to where his group of friends and acquaintances stood gathered, watching the last few people hand over their flags to the fire from afar, as the crowd in the centre of the room has slowly thinned out over time. "I swear, those things get hotter every year," Malik complained, and waved his hand around, after seemingly having managed to somehow burn himself in the process of putting a piece of fabric into a fire. "You could just be careful for once in your life," Athena advised, leaning over the high table they were standing at and supporting herself with both elbows on the plate. "Doesn't sound like me," Malik replied, putting the finger of his healthy hand onto his lips ponderingly, without ever stopping the shaking of his burned one. James chuckled at their bickering, before turning to his off-world friends. "So, what did you think of your first day for respect ceremony?" he asked candidly, and leaned backwards against the table. "A fascinating ritual, and not just one for idle vanity like so many are. Putting the past silently to rest, while still honouring it, feels like a desirable endeavour," Curie commented, the sheen of the licking flames reflecting in their synthetic eyes. "I also really like that burner. It burns so efficiently. It is very nice to observe." James couldn't argue with that. "For once, I can only agree with our dear Curie," Moore concurred, appreciatively closing her eyes and swinging her head up and down. "Quite a remarkable ceremony. I'm very glad that I got to witness this side of the humans as well." "A strange ritual by strange people," Conglosh mused, with his arms crossed in front of his body, not one of his eyes focusing on the conversation at hand, with all of them instead scanning around the room and taking in the impressions surrounding him everywhere. "But I can't say I haven't seen stranger before." James nodded. Nothing to add there as well. Now that all the flags were burned, and the cauldron was just kept aflame to make sure absolutely nothing remained afterwards, the mood started to lighten up. Even music began to play, and friendly conversations and laughter broke out all around them. Gone was the melancholic feeling of the past. Here was the now, surrounded by friends in festive mood. Finally, James turned to his left. "And you?" he asked Shida, who was leaned over the table just like Athena, and apparently was slowly starting to have enough of the noise around her. Shida put on an excusatory smile and looked around sheepishly, apparently trying to find the best way to say that she didn't really enjoy it. "Well, you know me," she finally said, avoiding eye contact while also turning to lean against the table backwards. "I'm mostly not one for this sentimental stuff." James chuckled and leaned against her, laying his head on top of hers, feeling her hair tickle his face as he did so. "Yeah, I getcha," he said quietly. "I mostly take part because I know it's important for Athena." Shida's ears curiously twitched and hit against James's nose in the process, causing him to briefly pull away. "So, you like her, huh?" Shida asked, and for a second James's heart sank. Not that there would or could ever be something between him and Athena, but he also didn't want Shida to think in that direction. However, he quickly realized that there wasn't any jealousy in her voice. He was sure if there was, she'd let him know. No. It sounded more earnestly interested than like an accusation. Yeah, she's a good one, he answered unabashedly, knowing fully well that Athena was well within earshot of their conversation. A huge pain in my ass as well, mind you, but she's a good one. Shida seemed to ponder that for a while, not saying anything as she thoughtfully lowered her gaze. Finally, she concluded in a breathless laugh. Heh, humans. James could only smile at that. Suddenly, he felt a nudge against his arm, and looking around to its source, he saw Nia, stretching herself out all the way across the table to push against his shoulder. Nodding her head in Shida's direction intently multiple times, and looking at James with big eyes, she asked, "Aren't you going to ask her for a dance?" James looked around for a moment. Indeed, now that music had started playing, some of the surrounding people had taken to dancing together with the shadows in the flickering twilight the fire provided for them. Still, James could only scoff. Cheekily, he leaned in towards Shida again, who had obviously heard the entire exchange from where she stood. "So, you want to dance?" he asked, offering his hand up in an inviting way. Shida looked at him through the corner of her eye, one eyebrow raised, and she obviously knew that he already knew her answer. "Yeah, right," she said with a brief snicker, and pushed his hand down again, to which James also snickered. However, their shared little joke had an unforeseen side effect, because right after Shida had rejected him, Admir suddenly swooped in for the side. "In that case, maybe you would honor me with a dance?" he asked, holding out his hand. For a second, Shida turned around with a slightly annoyed look in her eyes, as someone obviously not getting the hint. However, she then quickly realized that the offer was in no way meant for her. James scoffed in slight disbelief, looking down at the offered hand. Was he serious? Shida looked up at her boyfriend curiously, her gaze shifting between the two men for a moment. "Do you mind?" he asked, with a bemused laugh on his lips. Shida shook her head. "Go ahead," she said. However, before James took Admir up on his offer, he closed his arms around Shida and pressed a kiss onto her hair. "One dance," he said quietly, so that only her fine ears could hear, and then we go. Shida smiled softly, and just as he saw that, James already reached for the outstretched hand, immediately pulling Admir into a twirl around each other. The two were practiced partners on the dance floor, even if it had been a while, and they effortlessly read each other's movement. But although it reminded them of the past, it was very different from back then. Today their dance was simple, dumb fun, as they spun around each other or each other around, stepped back and forth in unison, and basically just moved however it came to mind, without much rhyme or reason to it. Yes, simple, dumb fun, with a wide smile on both of their faces, as they made their way across the dance floor, spinning, twirling, and weaving through the crowd of other dancers elegantly. Their whirlwind of a dance finally ended with them standing in front of the cauldron, as heat washed over them, forming a thin layer of sweat on their skin, as they were mesmerized by the orange glow. Already, nothing remained of the many flags that had been fed to it. Nothing but a very thin layer of soot at the bottom of the cauldron. Everything else had been erased. The heat seemed to remind Admir that one of his hands was burned, and he inadvertently started to shake it again, as if the pain had returned with the memory of the heat. James also remembered the moment the fire had touched his hand. Carefully he reached out his right palm, feeling the heat as a muted feeling in the robotic limb, as he brought it closer and closer to the fire, as if he was trying to warm himself. He stopped before the flames could lick at his skin again, but even though it was muffled by the synthetic nerves, he now felt the all-consuming heat very clearly. "What are you thinking?" Admir quietly whispered, leaning in to talk directly into his ear. James thought for a moment. What was he thinking? Finally, he said, "I'm getting that new arm."